welcome Professor Catherine Schifferdecker from Luther Seminary. She's a professor of Old Testament and at Luther. She did her advanced degree studies at Yale and Harvard Divinity Schools and is now a professor at Luther Seminary, holding the LDB level chair of Old Testament studies. She's a frequent contributor to is this a blog, theworkingpreacher.org?
It's a website for preachers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And is the author of Out of the Worldland, Creation Theology in the Book of Job. You didn't bring any copies with you.
I didn't.
Oh, sure. You can find them on Amazon. And she's currently writing a commentary on the Book of Esther. I want to thank you for joining us this morning.
Yeah. Thank you, Harold. And thanks for coming down from coffee. Good to be with you all here at Elam. I didn't realize, well, thank you to Harold and Ann for inviting me. I didn't realize that Ann's husband is one of my colleagues, Mark Trennick. So you guys are longtime members here. So
Not as long as some.
not as long as some. Well, we're happy to have Mark at Luther Seminary now. So it's a treasure. It's a treat to have him there. So. Well, as Harold said, my topic is, my first book was on Job. I'm actually just starting another book on Job that's a little more accessible than my dissertation turned to a book. And this is just a little bit of a warning. I could talk a long time about the book of Job. In fact, I usually teach a whole semester class on it. So I'm trying to limit, I am limiting myself this morning because I know we just have until 11:30 and I want to leave some time for questions. But just know that I may be talking a little fast. I want to begin, the topic that Harold and Ann suggested was something to do with ecology and environment and Bible. I know my friend Alan Padgett was here last year, I think, and so he told me that it was great to be here, and I think he suggested my name to them. So what I'm going to do is concentrate on one particular section of the book of Job, chapters 38 through 41, which is I'll get into what it is, but it has to do with creation. I want to begin, though, with reading portions from a prayer by St. Francis of Assisi called the Canticle of the Sun, because I think it's an appropriate prayer for as we talk about creation. So I won't read the whole thing because it's pretty long, but just a few selections. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no human is worthy to mention your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother, sun, who brings the day and you give light through him. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars in heaven. You form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, which is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister mother earth, who sustains us and governs us, and who produces varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Amen. So, what do you all think of when you think of the book of Job? What's the first thing that comes to mind? Yeah.
Suffering.
Suffering, yes. You know what I'm gonna... Tribulation, yeah. We all know the story of the book of Job. This is Marc Chagall, one of my favorite artists, calls this Job's despair. Suffering. The story of Job is the story of a man, a righteous man who suffers terribly, loses all of his wealth, loses his 10 children, loses his health, and then engages in a very long dialogue with 3 friends who aren't really very good friends. His friends accuse him of, sinning so that he deserves this suffering that has come upon him. And then finally, at the end of the book, God speaks to Job, and that's the part that we're going to be talking about. But I wanted to show this cartoon. I know you guys can't read it from back there, but I'll read it too. So it's a Peanuts cartoon, of course, appropriate for the Twin Cities. So Charlie Brown is pitching a baseball game. He says, 9 home runs in a row. Good grief. We're getting slaughtered again, Schrader. I don't know what to do. Why do we have to suffer like this? Charlie Brown says. Schrader says, man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upward. What? Charlie Brown says. Linus jumps in. He's quoting from the book of Job, Charlie Brown, 7th verse, 5th chapter. Actually, the problem of suffering is a very profound one. And then Lucy comes in. If a person has bad luck, it's because he's done something wrong. That's what I always say. That's what Job's friends told him, but I doubt what about Job's wife? I don't think she gets enough credit. So they're having this argument about Job. Is it Schrader says, I think a person who never suffers never matures. Suffering is actually very important. Lucy says, who wants to suffer? Don't be ridiculous. Whoever this one is, by Charlie Brown says, but pain is a part of life. Maybe that's Pigpen. Linus says, a person who speaks only of the patience of Job reveals that he knows very little of the book. Now, the way I see it, and Charlie Brown ends with, I don't have a ball team, I have a theological seminary. So they're arguing about the book of Job, which has fascinated people for millennia. So just a quick note about, or a quick outline of the book of Job, just to situate where we are. So the book of Job starts the first 2 chapters with the story of Job, how he's a righteous man and a wise man. And then the Satan challenges God to test Job with suffering. And so God agrees, and that's a whole other topic. And then you have this very long dialogue, as I said before. There's 3 cycles to it. Job and his 3 so-called friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Job speaks, and then Eliphaz responds, and then Job responds to Eliphaz, and then Bildad speaks, and Job responds to Bildad, and then Zophar speaks, Job responds to Zophar. So Job has a lot more airtime than everybody else. And basically, the dialogue breaks down in the 3rd cycle, and then there's this 1 chapter of a meditation on wisdom. Job gets the last word in this dialogue. He offers kind of a final defense and a call for God to speak to him. And then there's this 4th friend that comes in, Elihu, who we're not going to talk about at all because he's not spoken of either before he speaks or after he speaks. So most scholars, including me, thinks that the Elihu speeches are kind of a later addition to the book of Job, speaking of historical criticism. And then finally, after all the human beings have had their say, God speaks from a whirlwind in chapters 38 through 41. And the odd thing about God's speeches, though, is that he doesn't address Job's situation, doesn't talk about the bet with the Satan, doesn't apologize, doesn't talk about Job's suffering. Instead, God takes Job on this kind of whirlwind tour of creation. And outside of the book of Genesis, this is the longest sustained meditation on creation in the whole Bible, outside of the Genesis creation accounts, but not nearly as well known as those Genesis creation accounts. So that's why I want to spend some time on the God speeches and their talk about creation. And then finally, there's one more chapter, what Paul Harvey used to call the rest of the story, right? That old radio program, telling what happens to Job afterwards. So he gets restored, his life is restored, his health is restored. He and his wife have 10 more children, and then he lives for much longer. So I know there's a lot we could say, and you probably have a lot of questions about the book of Job, but because we only have this one, hour together, or less than that now, I'm just going to spend time on the God speeches and talk about what they might tell us about creation and about our place in creation. Job ends his speeches by saying this. He says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me." And then he goes on to say, I would give him an account of all my steps. I would defend myself, in other words. And then the words of Job are complete. Job at first, when he first encounters all of the suffering that he encounters, his first response is to, or I should say one of his first responses is to want to die. In chapter 3, he begins his speeches by just saying, why was I even born? Why was I not a stillbirth? Why did my mother conceive me? He just wants to die. He wants to be in the grave and at rest, to be away from all of this suffering. But then he moves in his speeches, in these many speeches, he moves from wanting to die to wanting to have his day in court. He wants God to answer him. He wants God to tell Job why he's suffering so much. He wants to defend his ways to God's face. And then again, after all the human beings have had their say, God appears in a whirlwind. Now, these illustrations that I'm using here, they're from William Blake. I love William Blake's illustrations of the book of Job. Published in 1825, Blake, of course, English mystic and poet and artist, and he did these illustrations of the book of Job. He always puts quotations from the book at the bottom, and I don't know how well you can see this, but here's God up on the upper right, in the whirlwind, speaking to Job. And one reason I really like Blake's illustrations is that Mrs. Job is always right there next to Job in Blake's illustrations. So Mrs. Job comes in for a bad rap from many interpreters, but here in Blake's illustrations, she's right there by Job, receiving this revelation from God. And then I don't know if you can see, but kind of right under God are the three friends just bowed down in fear from God's presence. But Job and his wife are looking at God and receiving this revelation. Now, there are actually two speeches out of the whirlwind from God. The first speech moves from the realms of cosmology, how the world was created, to meteorology. There's lots of talk about snow and ice and wind and storms and rain, to astronomy. God speaks about the stars, and then to zoology. This first speech spends a lot of time talking about various wild animals, no domestic animals, but all wild animals that God is showing Job. And then there's God tells Job, respond, tell me, answer me. And Job basically says, I can't say anything, I'm just going to be silent. And that doesn't seem to satisfy God. And so then God goes into a second speech where he talks about two mythological creatures. So he goes from cosmology to meteorology to zoology and then to mythology. And so God speaks about a creature called Behemoth, who is seems like a kind of mythical land creature, kind of a super hippopotamus. You might think about Behemoth. In Blake's illustration, it's the creature at the top there. And then God moves, and the longest part of the speech is devoted to Leviathan. And Leviathan is known from other texts from the ancient Near East as a kind of sea monster or sea dragon that is kind of a symbol of chaos, sometimes even a symbol of evil in the ancient world. But here in the book of Job, Leviathan seems to be, again, a very fearsome creature, kind of a super crocodile, you could say. He's covered with scales, but he also breathes forth fire. And God seems very proud of Leviathan. So there have been various reactions to the whirlwind speeches. many people, upon first reading them in the context of the book of Job, they don't really like them because it seems like God is kind of beating Job over the head with creation. Poor suffering Job, that God isn't showing any sympathy. So a Jewish scholar named S.B. Freehoff wrote about the speeches this way. He said, "Job cries, 'I am innocent,' and God responds, 'You are ignorant.' The answer seems not only irrelevant, but even unfeeling and heartless." And then my favorite quotation about the God speeches is William Safire, political commentator. He says, "It's as if God came out in a tie-dyed t-shirt with the words, 'Because I'm God, that's why.'" Which I think is a funny response and appropriate for the whirlwind speeches, at least if you read them a certain way. What I want to do, though, in the rest of my time is try to persuade you that there's more here than meets the eye, that it's not just God beating Job over the head with creation, but it's God inviting Job into this wild, beautiful creation, and inviting Job to humility, certainly, but also inviting Job to wonder, W-O-N-D-E-R, right? To awe and to delight in creation as God does. So to do that, I want to start out just by reading a few verses, selected verses from the whirlwind speeches, and I have some photos of creation that I got off of Google images. So let me just read a few selected passages here. And maybe imagine some majestic music behind it somehow. Right? All right. So the whirlwind speeches start out this way. "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, 'Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and set bars and doors and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed? Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on a land where no one lives, on the desert which is empty of human life? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth, and who has given birth to the hoarfrost of heaven? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the deer? Who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass, to which I have given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place? Do you give the horse its might? Do you clothe its neck with mane? Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars and spreads its wings towards the south? Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? Do you hear some of that? It really is, even taking it out of the context of the book of Job and the question of suffering, really is a beautiful vision of creation. And you'll note that all of the creatures that God talks about are wild creatures, right? The mountain goats and the ravens and the lions and the eagle and the hawk. They're all wild creatures that can't be controlled by human beings. So whatever else you think of the creation of the whirlwind speeches, the God speeches at the end of Job, they do provide, I think, a really beautiful vision of creation, and I think one that is particularly relevant for us in our age when we know the effect that we human beings have had on creation, right? We've been kind of a force to be reckoned with, and not in a good way, right? Especially as we talk about climate change and the changes that have happened already and that are coming. So I think these God speeches, these whirlwind speeches, are an important voice in Scripture to talk to us about our place in creation. So I want to get to those two themes I talked about. So I'm arguing that God in the whirlwind speeches is inviting Job, and thereby, Job is kind of an example or a type of all human beings. I think God is inviting humanity here to humility, but also to wonder, also to delight. So first, humility. There's a question in the book of Job, in Hebrew, ma'anosh, which translated into English means, what are human beings? Or what is humanity? Ma'anosh, what are human beings? So it comes up in Job chapter 7. This is Job speaking directly to God and kind of shaking his fist at God. Job says, what are human beings, ma'anosh, that you make so much of them, that you set your mind on them, visit them every morning, test them every moment. So Job's question is, what are human beings that you won't leave me alone, right? He imagines God as this kind of taskmaster who's just waiting for Job to sin, and then God's going to pounce on him. Most scholars, including me, think that Job, or the author of Job, is deliberately echoing probably a more famous passage from Psalm chapter 8. Perhaps you remember this. I should have put the verse before this on it. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, when I look at the stars, the work of your fingers, what are human beings, the psalmist says, ma'anosh, that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them. And then the psalmist goes on to say, yet you have made them just a little lower than the angels. You've given them dominion over the works of your hands. I think that Job, or the writer of Job, is deliberately referring to Psalm 8. But the author of Job has a much different answer. Not that God has made human beings just a little lower than the angels, but that God is, unnecessarily paying attention to human beings and waiting for them to sin. Now, the striking thing about the whirlwind speeches, the God speeches in Job, are that there's so many wild creatures mentioned, but there's one glaring kind of absence of a creature, and that is human beings really have no place in the whirlwind speeches. They're mentioned just very peripherally, like the war horse and its rider, right? Or the dawn comes to shake the wicked out of the earth. So the wicked, of course, are human beings. Or in kind of a humbling example, the eagle and the hawk feast on the fallen soldiers on a battlefield, right? So human beings have really no place, or not much of a place in the whirlwind speeches amongst all the other creatures that are mentioned in these speeches. This is especially apparent in this particular passage. So let me give you just a little Hebrew. I promise I won't get too deep into it. There's a couple of really common Hebrew words for humanity, or sometimes for particularly a man or an individual human being. And those two words are ish and adam. You see them here in the brackets, ish and adam. And they both just mean man or human being or person. You notice Adam is the name of, right, Adam, as in Adam and Eve. But Adam can also just mean any human being, and particularly a man. Now, as you might imagine, these words appear all over the place in the Bible. They're very, very common, and including in the first 37 chapters of the book of Job. These words are used over and over and over again. But in the whirlwind speeches, in the God speeches, they only appear in this verse. Let me read this in English. Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt to bring rain on the uninhabited land? So literally in the Hebrew it says land with no man, land with no ish. The wilderness where no person lives, wilderness with no person in it, no Adam in it. To satisfy the waste and desolate land and to cause the parched land to sprout grass. This is the only place where these very common words appear, person, man. And you notice the only place in the whirlwind speeches where they appear, and they're negated here. So no man, right? No person, no human being. God sends rain on the land where no human being will benefit from it. Now remember where this is written, right? This is in the Near East, right? Which back then and now is a place where water is a very, very precious resource, right? This is not the land of 10,000 lakes, right? The land of Israel or Palestine now. It's a land that is semi-arid and that relies completely on the spring rains and the fall rains in order to grow food, right? So for God to say, I bring rain on a land with no human being in it, right? On the wilderness where no person lives, to satisfy the waste and desolate land and to cause the parched land to sprout grass. That's a kind of humbling view of humanity, right? That God cares for land where no human being, sends rain on land where no human being will benefit from it. We sometimes think about, or we sometimes speak, I think probably more in the past than now, but we sometimes speak of a place or a wilderness or a desert as God-forsaken, right? A God-forsaken place. The whirlwind speeches say there is no place on earth that is God-forsaken. There may be places that are human-forsaken, right, where human beings can't survive or can't benefit. But there is no place that is outside of God's care and God's attention. Another passage, I'm just doing a few passages here, though I could give you a lot more examples. So again, we're talking about that God is calling Job to humility. Let me put it this way. The whirlwind speeches are radically non-anthropocentric. The whirlwind speeches are radically non-human-centered. If you think about, in comparison, the Genesis creation accounts, right, where God creates human beings as the last of creation and gives them dominion over everything else. This is a different view of humanity, that question, what are human beings? The whirlwind speech answers that question, what are human beings, by saying, well, you're part of creation, but you're not the center, right? I would say that the whirlwind speeches are radically God-centered rather than human-centered, this vision of creation. God goes on to say to Job, who has let the wild ass go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift ass? To which I have given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place. It scorns the tumult of the city. It does not hear the shouts of the driver. It ranges the mountains as its pasture, and it searches after every green thing. So the wild donkey, it scorns the tumult of the city. This is another place I see this radical kind of non-human-centered nature, or this call to humility. The city really is the quintessential human invention, right? The city is the quintessential human habitat, right? We all live in a city or in a metropolitan area. The wild donkey laughs at the city and doesn't hear the voice of the taskmaster, is completely free, completely outside of human dominion. Compare this to the very first chapter of Job, where it lists how much livestock he has. Job had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. He had 500 donkeys, domesticated donkeys. This was part of his wealth. It seems to me God is saying, look, unlike their domesticated cousins, the wild donkeys will not serve you. They won't be of any use to you. Similarly, he has 500 yoke of oxen, so 500 pairs of oxen. God goes on to say, is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will it spend the night at your crib? Can you tie it in the furrow with ropes, or will it harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on it because its strength is great? Do you have faith in it that it will return and bring your grain to your threshing floor? The obvious answer is no. The wild ox is not going to do this. Again, unlike all those oxen that you owned back at the beginning of the book, these wild creatures will be of no use to you and are not under your control. All right, one more example, but this is the biggest one. In the second speech, I said that God moves to these kind of mythological creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And the longest part of the whirlwind speeches is devoted to Leviathan, this one on the bottom, this kind of sea dragon or sea monster that spits out fire. Before I get to the text, though, let me just a little bit of audience participation here. How do we, human beings, how do we use animals?
Servants to help us.
Servants to help us, yeah. Particularly, probably more in the older days, right? When oxen, pulled plows. They still do that in Ethiopia. I spent a year in Ethiopia.
For now would be comfort, probably.
Yeah, probably comfort, pets. Yeah, companionship, pets. Though obviously we have service dogs, right? For people with handicap, blind folks. We have what are they called? Companion comfort animals. I forget what they're called, but yeah. But pets, companionship. How else do we use animals? Food, yeah. Probably the biggest way we use animals, at least certain types of animals, right? Food, yeah. I just bought a quarter of a beef from a farmer in southwest Minnesota because we like to buy direct from the farmers, and we're enjoying that beef. We are not vegetarians in my household, though we try to not eat meat all the time. Food. So food, companionship, service. How else do we use animals? I can think of one other major category.
Entertainment sometimes.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, entertainment, like horse racing or dog racing. Yeah, I didn't think about that. What about, I have my leather bag here, right? We use animals for clothing, certainly not as much as, maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But leather goods, leather shoes, some people wear fur, right? So some, clothing or other materials. Think about that. Think about all those categories when you read or hear me read this text. So this is about Leviathan, this sea monster. God says to Job, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down its tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it make many supplications to you? Will it speak soft words to you? Will it make a covenant with you to be taken as your servant forever?" Right? So will it serve you? Will you play with it as with a bird, or will you put it on a leash for your girls? Right? Will it be a pet for you? Will traders bargain over it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Right? Will it be food for you in the marketplace? Can you fill its skin with harpoons or its head with fishing spears? By the way, this seems to be the way that crocodiles were hunted back in biblical times. Harpoons, fishing spears, putting a rope in its nose or piercing its jaw with a hook. So God basically says to Job, can you use Leviathan in any of the ways that humanity uses other animals? And here's the answer. lay hands on it, think of the battle, you will not do it again, God says. Probably because, Job wouldn't be alive to do it, try it again, right? This Leviathan, this kind of sea dragon, cannot, again, like the wild ox, like the wild donkey, cannot be used for human gain or human use in any of the ways that human beings use animals. These speeches highlight these wild creatures, including especially Leviathan. And God seems to take special delight in creatures that are wild and beautiful in their wildness and not tameable, not able to be domesticated. It reminds me of this piece from this beautiful papal encyclical by Pope Francis. Maybe some of you have read this, Laudato Si. I think it came out in 2015, maybe right around then. Pope Francis says, concerning other creatures, we can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. We can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. In other words, these creatures, these wild creatures that we share this earth with, are valuable not because they are of use to us, they are valuable simply because they are fellow creatures, created by God. Job, in his, in the chapters previous to this, in the first chapter, Job was kind of the center of his universe. He was surrounded by his family and his peers and companions. He was the leader of his society, basically kind of, he compares himself to a king sitting amongst his troops. He's surrounded kind of on the fringes of society by the widows and the orphans and the foreigners, and he's very righteous. He takes care of these vulnerable people. But again, he's more or less the center of the universe, center of his world. In the whirlwind speeches, God breaks open that ordered world and takes Job out to where the wild things are. Right? If you remember that lovely children's book, where the wild things are. The whirlwind speeches, I think, take Job out to where the wild things are and opens his vision to a world that he never even thought about, right? In his very orderly world, he never thought about these wild creatures. So I think the whirlwind speeches call Job to humility. At the same time, it must be said that Job is the only passenger on this tour of creation, on this whirlwind tour. And so even though the speeches call him to humility, I don't think that's the end of it. I think humanity in the whirlwind speeches is not the center of creation, but humanity has a place in creation in the person of Job. And I think that place is this, that God invites Job, and thereby us as well, to delight in creation as God does. And here's then that second theme, and I'll go faster here, because I want to leave some time for questions. I think God invites Job to wonder, to delight in creation. You know what, I'll go quickly. There's a particular Hebrew word called suk that means to put a fence or a boundary. And it happens just 3 times in Job. First in the Satan at the beginning says, "Is it for nothing that Job fears God? Have you not put a fence around him and around his house and around all that he owns on every side?" So the Satan says, look, of course Job praises you because you've put a protective fence around him, right? So that nothing can harm him. And then Job, when he's cursing the day of his birth, he says, "Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has fenced in?" So for Job, instead of a protective fence, this kind of boundary around him is almost like a straitjacket. It's come around him, and the world has descended into chaos, and he's being oppressed. The third time the word is used is in these whirlwind speeches, where God says, "Who fenced in the sea with doors when it came bursting out from the womb, when I made a cloud its clothing and thick darkness its swaddling clothes. I think these three uses of this word talk about three different ways of thinking about God's ordering of the world. So the Satan says God orders the world so that the righteous are protected and nothing harmful can reach them. And Job says, no, the world is ordered in such a way that it's all chaos and God just is oppressing us, right? Is waiting for us to sin or is inflicting suffering for us. And God says, no, neither one of those things is right? God says there is order in the universe, right? I put boundaries on the sea so that it cannot overwhelm the land. But I also give the sea a place in creation, right? And I give Leviathan a place in creation. And I give, the wild animals a place in creation. And again, God seems to take delight in just those things that are wild and beautiful, and also, frankly, sometimes dangerous to human beings, right? I think about, I'll skip that slide. One time, my family and I were at a family reunion at the YMCA of the Rockies in Colorado, and we went for a hike. This isn't a picture I took, this is just something I got up from Google Slides, but it was similar to this. We were hiking pretty high altitude, and we came to some glaciers, and there was a sign that basically said, don't be stupid, right? Don't play on the glaciers or you're gonna, regret it. But the title of the sign was, Mountains Don't Care, right? Like, if you're dumb enough to, play on the glacier, play on the snow, mountains aren't gonna save you, right? Mountains don't care. So you need to be cautious, right? You need to practice wisdom here. So this is the kind of thing I'm getting at, right? That God creates the world in such a way that there are things wild and beautiful and also risky, right? This is not a completely safe world for human beings. We know that, right? We know that when hurricanes come. We know that when earthquakes happen. We know that when, wildfires happen. God doesn't create the world in such a way that he places protection around every person or even every righteous person. God creates the world, a risky world, a wild world, but a world beautiful in its wildness. This is what I'm trying to say. And God invites us to wonder at, to delight in that beauty. I'm going to move through these slides and just say this. I think the other thing that God invites Job to wonder at is just the variety in creation, right? All of the wild creatures that God talks about are often depicted as parents, and God instills the gift of life and the gift of procreation and fecundity. Creation isn't just a one-off thing. And God doesn't just create one flower, right? Or one tree or one kind of animal. God creates a whole variety. And God gives them within themselves the ability to continue life, right? Both in the trees and in the animals and in humanity. It's the one commandment humanity has fulfilled really well. Be fruitful and multiply, right? But the animals too, right? God instills this primal life force and this variety. Annie Dillard in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek puts it really well. She says, the Creator goes off on one wild specific tangent after another, or millions simultaneously, with an exuberance that would seem to be unwarranted, and with an abandoned energy sprung from an unfathomable font. What is going on here? The point of the dragonfly's terrible lip, the giant waterbug, birdsong, or the beautiful dazzle and flash of sunlighted minnows is not that it all fits together like clockwork, but that it all flows so freely wild like the creek, that it all surges in such a free fringed tangle. Freedom is the world's water and weather, the world's nourishment freely given, its soil and sap, and the Creator loves pizzazz. Isn't that great? The Creator loves pizzazz. All right, I'm going to end by playing a song, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. This interpretation of the whirlwind speeches is a very positive one, and not everyone will agree with it. When, some people read the whirlwind speeches again as God kind of banging Job over the head with creation. But it all depends on the tone in which you hear them. And so I want to play you a song that I think strikes the right tone. It's an interpretation of the whirlwind speeches called Where Were You? By a guy named Justin Roberts from a CD called Why Not Sea Monsters. So I probably won't play the whole song just for the sake of time, but let me play just some of it, and I'll put the words up here as I play it. Because I think he gets the tone of wonder here.
Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? And where were you when I set the stars in place and they all sang together? All sang together. And they all sang together up in space. Where were you when I filled the seas and oceans? And where were you when I locked them in the land and they all sang together? All sang together. And they all sang together on the sand. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Where were you when I formed the ancient atoms? And where were you when I fashioned life a home and it all sang together? All sang together. And it all sang together on the phone. Where were you when I set the leopard running? And where were you when I taught the birds their songs and they all sang together? All sang together. And they all sang together in that bright and brilliant dawn. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Where were you when I set the snow in store for the winter? Ever wonder who lays the rain up high? Can you tell me who cuts a highway through the sky with the lightning and the thunder? You're perfect through and through, and the words you say are true. Where were you?
I think that gives you a sense of it. It's just a really lovely interpretation of the whirlwind speeches. So in the end, God invites Job, I think, to humility and to wonder. I think the tone of the speeches is invitational rather than confrontational. I mean, they're probably both, but I think the reason that I want to bring them up here is that I think they speak particularly to us in our time, again, where we know our effect that we've had on the rest of creation, to call us to a certain humility, right? That we are simply a part of creation and not the center of creation, but that we are invited as image of God, as the creatures created in the image of God. We are invited to delight in creation as God does, and to take care of creation and to make sure that life continues as God intends it to in this wild, beautiful world that God has made. So, comments, questions in our last 5 minutes?
Question.
Yeah.
From your research, what was going on in the world that would influence the author to write Job?
That's a great question. I think that the book of Job is probably written during the exile, during the Babylonian exile. It seems to be addressing a situation of great suffering, and of course, in the life of Israel and the Jews, you can pick lots of different times of great suffering, of course. But I think it's written during the exile, and I think that the author of the book doesn't find the answer for suffering in covenant, right? In the Sinai covenant, much as Isaiah does, for instance, but moves back kind of before the covenant to creation to look for the answer to suffering in creation itself. So that's my own theory. No one really knows when the book of Job was written, but I don't think, I should have said this at the beginning, I do not think that Job is a historical book, and I don't think it's meant to be taken as a historical book. It begins, the very first verse of Job is, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and this man was righteous and forthright. It begins in a kind of long ago and far away kind of language, right? There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Now you might say, well, it's not far away, it's the land of Uz, but you might as well say the land of Oz, because no one knows where Uz was. Like, even the rabbis of Jesus' time don't know where Uz is. It seems to be a kind of made-up name. And even the rabbis of Jesus' time think, some of them say, yeah, Job is a kind of parable. So listen to the language. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, give me my inheritance, right? Or there was a man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and robbers beset him, right? Those parables that Jesus tells, I think the language of Job kind of, not that it's a parable, it's much, much longer than a parable, but it's something like that. It's a setup of, okay, let's imagine the most righteous person in the world, and he suffers. Why does he suffer? Well, there's a bet between God and the Satan. But that's like just the first 2 chapters. And then the 40 chapters of it really is about, what do we do now, right? What do we do with suffering now? How do we talk about God when we suffer? Or how do we think about the world or our place in the world when we suffer? And I realize I haven't touched on suffering that much, but I could, again, say a lot more about how I think the creation speeches address suffering, but that's outside the bounds of our topic for today. So, other question? Yeah, Harold.
The metaphor of fences.
Yeah.
I think about the fences they talk about at the zoos that keep the animals in or the people out. and so are they in some way protecting chaos and nature from man, constraining him? That's
an idea, yeah. Yeah, I like that. Constraining human beings rather than, the animals. It reminds me of, in Leviticus, you have all these laws about unclean animals. You can't eat the weasel. I don't know that I would ever want to eat a weasel, but you can't eat pigs, you can't eat other animals. And we don't really know there's lots of theories about why that is, but one of the theories I like says, basically, these laws dampen down the killer instinct in human beings. And these dietary laws say, you can't eat everything that moves. Kind of constrains human beings from, killing everything. So, I don't know if that is similar, but everybody did. One last question or comment or anything?
I'm curious about why this part of Job doesn't ever get talked about, and how you think it could be done in a different way in our common era that we live in.
I think it doesn't get talked about in large. Well, I mean, one thing is Job really doesn't come up in the lectionary very much at all. In the Revised Common Lectionary, I think that's probably part of it. Luther Seminary has a kind of alternative lectionary called the Narrative Lectionary, where we do a 4-part series on Job. That's another topic, but I think it doesn't come up for a preaching text very much, maybe 3 times in 3 years. And it's daunting, right? I think for preachers trying to talk about Job in one 15-minute sermon is just almost impossible. So a lot of preachers, I think, avoid it. And then I don't know about for Bible study. I guess mostly people are interested in Job because of the question of suffering, and so the creation part doesn't come up as much. But as I say, I have a new book contract. I'm going to try to write a book on Job that addresses some of those questions and includes what I talked about this morning. But if you're interested, let me just say this. There's a book that was just published this year. It's called the Oxford Handbook on Bible and Ecology. Wrong preposition. The Oxford Handbook of Bible and Ecology. I wrote a chapter on Job in there, but it has, I'm trying not to be self-promoting here, but if you're interested in this topic of Bible and ecology, or how the Bible addresses environmental concerns, that would be a really good resource, because there's, I don't know, like 30 chapters on various parts of the Bible and what they say about ecology and environment. So if you're interested in that. Thank you so much.
Good, Catherine.